Have you ever trusted someone who seemed perfect, only to realize later that something didn't add up? Sometimes words reveal more than they appear to, and when he says certain things, he's unknowingly showing what really lies behind the mask. That discovery can be uncomfortable, even shocking, but it's the first step toward breaking free from dangerous illusions. Language doesn't just communicate, it also exposes. In this video, we'll explore how innocuous-sounding phrases can be profound signals that you're dealing with someone very different from who you thought. Get ready to question not only the other person, but also your own perceptions. Because often, what we choose to hear says as much about what we refuse to see. If you're ready to open your eyes, comment below, "I see beyond the words." Carl Jung taught us that human beings live in constant tension between what is conscious and what remains hidden in the unconscious. When someone utters words that make us doubt who they really are, we may be witnessing manifestations of the shadow, one of the central concepts in analytical psychology. The shadow represents all the repressed, denied, or unintegrated aspects of the self. When a man speaks phrases that come across as manipulative, dishonest, or contradictory, he may be projecting unconscious traits he hasn't faced within himself. Those verbal expressions can also reflect an inflated ego, where the persona, the social mask he presents to the world, is completely disconnected from his inner essence. At that point, the risk of projecting an idealized image onto him is high. Often, we don't see the other person as they truly are, but as we need them to be. Projection is the mechanism by which we attribute our own unconscious contents to someone else, preventing us from seeing clearly. Once we begin to identify these phrases and their hidden meanings, we embark on the process of individuation, the journey toward integrating the totality of the self. This includes acknowledging both the masculine and the feminine within us, the animus and the anima, and not relying on another to complete what can only be found internally. Listening attentively and interpreting another's words through a Jungian lens becomes an exercise in self-knowledge and a liberation from projected illusions. It's common to be swept away by well-chosen words, by phrases that sound like promises or perfect reflections of what we long to hear. When someone says exactly what you need in a moment of vulnerability, it's easy to believe you've found someone who truly understands and welcomes your soul. But that's precisely where the danger lies. The charm of the words may be masking a very different inner reality. In Jungian analytics, this phenomenon is directly linked to the concept of the persona, the social mask we construct to present ourselves to the world. The persona is necessary for life in society. We all need an identity that relates to the collective. However, when that mask becomes rigid, superficial, or used as a manipulation tool, it becomes a barrier between the true self and others. Many men, especially in romantic relationships, build a seductive, caring, understanding persona, but only on the surface. The persona becomes a carefully rehearsed theater, and it's through words that it most fully expresses itself. When someone repeats phrases like, "You're different from anyone else," "I've never felt this way before," or "Only with you can I truly be myself," they may be trying to trigger in you an intense, swift, and often artificial emotional bond. These are phrases that directly appeal to your lack, your need for validation, and your desire to feel special, deep elements of the collective unconscious, especially in matters of the heart. Yet behind these enchanting words, the shadow often lurks. According to Jung, the shadow comprises the aspects of personality the ego refuses to recognize as its own. They are repressed traits, hidden desires, denied emotions. The shadow isn't inherently evil, but it becomes dangerous when ignored because it operates outside conscious awareness, influencing actions and relationships. When someone seduces you with sweet words, but their behavior fails to uphold them, you're facing a conflict between the persona and the shadow. The persona proclaims, "I'm trustworthy, sensitive, present." The hidden shadow harbors coldness, selfishness, a fear of intimacy, or a desire for control. That dissonance begins to surface in small actions, in inconsistencies between words and behavior, in silences that contradict warm declarations. It's crucial to realize that the true danger lies not only in the other person, but also in our willingness to believe without questioning. Jung invites us to look inward and ask ourselves, why do these words captivate me so strongly? What is it in me that wants to believe them? Often, our own shadow will answer. It may be our insecurity, our emotional neediness, or the idealized image we project onto the other. When we aren't vigilant, We become accomplices to the illusion. Listening consciously is thus an act of protection and self-discovery. It isn't about distrusting everything, but about learning to distinguish the voice of the soul from the voice of the masked ego. Charming phrases aren't inherently false, but they need to be observed in the context of actions, patterns, and emotional consistency. If the words are beautiful but not backed up by lived experience, it's likely the persona is being used as a facade while the shadow works behind the scenes. The Jungian proposal isn't to judge, but to integrate. When we recognize this dynamic, we have the opportunity to confront the other person with their incoherence, but also to look inward and discover why we were so inclined to believe. Healing begins when we stop projecting onto others what we need to find within ourselves. And that includes love, recognition, and truth. Narcissism, in its subtlest form, often hides behind words that sound caring, even generous, but carry within them the logic of control, validation, and self-admiration. When a man says things like, "Everything I do is for you," "You're lucky to have someone like me," or "Nobody will love you the way I do," it may at first seem like deep affection. However, through a Jungian lens, these phrases express the dynamics of an inflated ego and a manipulative persona operating alongside an unintegrated shadow. Jung understood narcissism not only as visible vanity or selfishness, but as a radical disconnection from the self. A narcissistic individual is, at heart, someone who builds an identity based on idealizations, both of themselves and of the world around them, to avoid confronting inner fragilities and voids. Narcissism then becomes an ego defense mechanism to evade the shadow, which contains everything the person refuses to acknowledge: insecurity, fear of rejection, a sense of insufficiency. The words spoken by this type of man serve a clear function: to maintain his idealized self-image intact, while emotionally capturing the other, making them an extension of his own ego. "You'd be nothing without me," for example, might be implied in excessive compliments that actually serve to confirm his centrality in the relationship. By listening carefully, you can perceive that many of these phrases aren't really about you, but about him, about how he wants to be seen, recognized, and adored. From a Jungian perspective, this behavior is also tied to a refusal of individuation, the process of becoming fully oneself by unifying conscious and unconscious aspects of the being. The narcissistic man avoids this path because it demands humility, vulnerability, and the abandonment of perfection fantasies. Instead of seeking self-integration, he reinforces the persona, a charming, generous, reliable character. Yet when that persona starts to be questioned, when you notice contradictions between his words and actions, he may react with veiled aggression, emotional blackmail, or withdrawal. That happens because the narcissistic ego cannot tolerate being exposed. It fears the collapse of its carefully constructed image. The phrases that reveal disguised narcissism always carry a subtext. When someone says, "No one understands me like you," they may be trying to trap you in a savior role. When they say, "You inspire me to be better," they might actually be setting themselves up as a constant improvement project to keep you emotionally invested. These statements aren't necessarily lies, but they become manipulative tools when used to avoid confronting one's own shadow and to hold the other emotionally captive. It's important to recognize that language in this context becomes a mirror of the unconscious. The words we use, especially the ones we repeat under stress, reveal the deepest contents of the psyche. Therefore, when you listen to someone who speaks in an inflated, overly seductive, or self-centered way, it's necessary to activate discernment and ask yourself, are these words really about genuine connection or about control and validation? The most challenging part, however, is acknowledging the role of our own psyche in this symbolic game. Jung warned that projection is a central obstacle on the path to individuation. When we idealize someone to the point of failing to see the narcissism behind their words, we're projecting our desire for salvation, love, or security onto a person who only represents those qualities but doesn't sustain them. So the deepest work is to reclaim those projections and look at what still needs to be fulfilled within ourselves. The phrases that reveal narcissism aren't just warning signs about who stands before us. They're also invitations to explore why, at some point, we chose to believe them. From an early age, we're taught, subtly or explicitly, to idealize masculine figures. Whether through fairy tales, romantic films, or family dynamics, The archetype of the ideal man is established as an unconscious model that shapes our choices and perceptions. When someone says exactly what we hope to hear, it's not just the real person speaking, it's also the archetype being activated within us. In Jungian psychology, this is understood as a projection of the animus, the masculine archetype that inhabits every woman's unconscious. It's within this symbolic dynamic that we often confuse desire with truth. Projection is one of the psyche's most powerful and treacherous mechanisms. It prevents us from seeing another as they really are, causing us to see in them what we carry inside and have not yet acknowledged. When we project the animus onto a man, we attribute to him qualities we want to find in ourselves: strength, direction, protection, intelligence, security. And if he meets that fantasy with words like, "I will take care of you," "Trust me, I know what I'm doing," or "You don't have to worry about a thing, I've got this," the tendency is to plunge headlong into the illusion. These phrases aren't inherently problematic. They may come from a genuine place of care and presence. What makes them dangerous is how often, upon hearing them, we cease to see reality and start interacting with an image, an ideal. Jung said that projection solves an internal problem, while the other person behaves according to the projected image. But when he begins to step away from that role, disillusionment is inevitable. We discover with pain that he was never what we thought, and that in fact we were the ones seeing him through the lens of desire. Here too the shadow plays a role. The idealized masculine often hides the refusal to face the wounded masculine, the part that exists within us and needs healing. By placing another on a pedestal, we deny our own internal capacities for guidance, strength, and decision-making. We delegate to him what we fear assuming ourselves. This dynamic is especially common in relationships with an emotional power imbalance. The man becomes the safe harbor, the guide, the provider, and the woman, without realizing it, places herself in a position of emotional, intellectual, and even spiritual dependence. When that man says phrases reinforcing this imbalance, "Without me you'd be lost," "I'm the only one who understands you," he may be unconsciously exploiting the power he holds over the fantasy you've projected onto him. He may not even be aware of it, but the symbolic manipulation is already underway, and the price to pay is high: loss of emotional autonomy, self-censorship, and a constant fear that everything will collapse if he leaves. Yet the key to breaking this illusion lies precisely in recognizing the projection. Jung invites us to reclaim the animus from the outside world and integrate it internally. That means acknowledging that the strength, clarity, discernment, and security we see in another can and should be developed within ourselves. When we do this, we no longer need someone else to say what we want to hear in order to feel whole. We begin to listen with clarity, without neediness, without filters, and with the courage to see what is really being said and lived. The confusion between desire and truth dissolves when we look at the other without the veil of the archetype. This doesn't mean abandoning love or connection, but allowing these feelings to grow based on reality rather than fantasy. That's where true intimacy begins, when the projected image falls away and the real person can finally be seen and accepted with light and shadow. Listening is an act of deep presence, but also one of the most challenging experiences on the path to self-knowledge, not only because it requires attention and empathy, but because it forces us to face the impact that another's words have on us. When someone says something that disturbs, enchants, or confuses us, they are unknowingly activating hidden regions of our psyche. Jung teaches us that these intense reactions usually say more about us than about them. Listening consciously, then, means realizing that every word that moves us deeply is an invitation to inner investigation. In analytical psychology, this process is directly linked to confronting the shadow, the aspects of ourselves that have been repressed, denied, or ignored throughout life. When a man says something that provokes a disproportionate emotional response, it's a sign that he's touched a part of our shadow. Maybe he said, "You're too sensitive," or "You're overreacting again." Phrases that on their own could be neutral, but in certain contexts activate memories, beliefs, and wounds buried in the unconscious. The intensity of our reaction reveals that there's something there that needs careful attention. But there's also the other side of listening. When we hear words that seduce us, make us feel special, valued, admired. Phrases like, "You are everything I've ever dreamed of," "With you it's different," or "You make me want to change," can touch our deepest desire to be loved, recognized, chosen. And this is where conscious listening becomes even more essential. Because the shadow isn't only made of pain and fear, it also includes our most intense desires and secret fantasies. If we let ourselves be carried away by those phrases without question, we risk falling into the trap of projection, fueling illusions and expectations that reality can't sustain. Jung pointed out that the path of individuation, the process of becoming an entire, integrated human being, involves the capacity to recognize, welcome, and integrate the shadow. That means observing not only what hurts us, but also what enchants us irrationally. When we listen to someone consciously, we pay attention not only to the content of what's said, but to our own internal response. We listen with the ears of the soul, not just with our physical senses. This kind of listening is a practice of presence and emotional maturity. It means accepting that the other can have shadows, contradictions, manipulations, but also that we have ours. It means accepting that we may have believed lies because they spared us from facing painful truths. And above all, it means that every time we truly listen, we deepen the relationship with our own unconscious. True self-knowledge doesn't happen in silence, but in dialogue, not only with the other, but with what the other awakens in us. Every word that wounds, elevates, or unsettles us is a symbol, and like all symbols, it carries multiple layers of meaning. Listening consciously is being open to deciphering those layers, even when what we find is hard to accept. In the end, this listening becomes a tool of discernment. We learn to notice when we're being manipulated, when we're projecting, and when we're simply facing naked truth, which isn't always pleasant, but is liberating. The silence that follows conscious listening isn't empty, it's full of wisdom. It's in that silence that we begin to see ourselves more clearly, and consequently to see the other with greater truth. The path to seeing another with clarity begins within us. The words they say, whether sweet, manipulative, or contradictory, are symbolic invitations to look beyond the surface and confront the images we project. Jungian psychology teaches us that nothing that affects us deeply is accidental. Everything we hear that resonates within has connections to hidden aspects of our own psyche. The persona can seduce, the shadow can confuse, and the animus can deceive, but when we cultivate conscious listening and integrate these inner forces, we begin to see with the eyes of the soul. This journey isn't easy, but it's liberating. It restores our power of choice, discernment, and above all, authenticity. By recognizing the signals in words and silences, we start to protect ourselves not with walls, but with awareness. If you felt this content touched a part of yourself that had been forgotten, don't ignore the call. Subscribe to the channel, leave your comment, and watch the next video on your screen now. Your transformation begins when you choose to see what has always been right before your eyes.